Greetings, media and popular culture people, and welcome to your first video lecture for the semester. And so we're going to begin this first week talking about, what is popular culture? How does the media figure into this? What is media? And near as I can tell, the media is the stuff of popular culture. It's what enables, or at least used to enable, popular culture to exist. It's the stuff, at least the artifacts, the media artifacts, are the things that we share in order to construct popular culture to the extent that such a thing exists. So clearly we're talking about some philosophical ideas here, and so we begin with a reading from a German philosopher by the name of Walter Benjamin. I know it looks like Benjamin, but it's pronounced, if you're fancy, it's pronounced Benjamin. Benjamin was a German scholar associated with the Frankfurt School who died on the run from the Nazis in 1940. So he was living and writing and thinking at the time of the Second World War. And the piece that I asked you to read for this week was a work called "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction." And so what I'm doing in asking you to read this is I'm grappling with this question of media and kind of trying to figure out, what is it? How does it figure into popular culture? Mass media in particular, right? And this is one of the first important essays to deal with mass media and to take on the effects of mass media and how it changed our understanding of art. And so, what mass media does, if I'm to oversimplify it, is it distributes art in the form of media artifacts. So maybe it's books that are published and put out in bookstores and then purchased by audiences. Maybe it's movies that you go to the movie theater to see. Maybe it's movies that you watch at home on streaming on Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or what have you. But all these are works of art. And of course, when we got to the point where we could reproduce works of art mechanically, it changed, at least this is what Benjamin argues, is it changed the very nature and in some sense the purpose of the artwork. So, he begins his famous essay with a conversation about originality and the reproduction of art. So if we go back, and we don't have to go back too far, we can just go back about 200 years. And when we do this, we find that artworks, original artworks, like the Mona Lisa, for example, had a very distinct presence in time and space. They enjoyed a unique kind of existence, meaning that, there's only one Mona Lisa. Now, Benjamin talks about early forms of reproduction. He talks about the fact that as long as there's been art, in some sense, we've been reproducing it. But in the old days, reproducing an artwork like the Mona Lisa was very tedious. You had to sit down and make your own painting and copy Da Vinci's painting, and it took a long time. And this, in some sense, meant that the original artwork, the original Mona Lisa hanging in the Louvre in Paris, enjoyed a very particular kind of existence, a very unique existence. It was, in a real sense, the only one of its kind, right? And as a result, it had this special location in time and space. Number one, it had a unique location in time and space because of when it was created and how it was created, right? Leonardo da Vinci sits down and he paints this painting, and it takes a long time. And it's made up of unique brush strokes, all, man-made, put together, painted at a very specific time by a very specific man. And ever since then, there's only been one that occupies a very specific spot in the world, right? And what Benjamin is saying is that back in the day, this is how art existed for the most part, right? It was made by hand. It was made by people through artistic endeavors. And once it was created, it enjoyed a kind of authenticity, a kind of originality. But Benjamin says what happens is that in time, as we learn to reproduce artwork mechanically, that is through a printing press or lithography, or more recently through photography and film, what happens is that the artwork no longer enjoys this kind of unique existence, right? Instead of just being one unique painting in the Louvre, we now can buy Mona Lisa toilet paper, right? You could buy a Mona Lisa sweatshirt. You could buy your own poster of the Mona Lisa that you could hang in your dorm room, right? And so as a result, what this means is that in some sense, art that's been made since the advent of this mechanical reproduction doesn't enjoy this same sort of unique existence, right? In reproducing art, even in reproducing art that was made prior to mechanical reproduction, what happens is it changes the ontology or the essence of the artwork. And so you can understand, perhaps, when you see the Mona Lisa toilet paper, that it changes in some way the value or the essence of the artwork. So what he's talking about here, at least from one perspective, is the authority of the artwork. And he says, confronted with its manual reproduction, which was usually branded as forgery. So now he's talking about the way we used to reproduce artworks prior to mechanical reproduction. So when confronted with its manual reproduction, which was usually branded as forgery, the original preserved all its authority. So if I tried to reproduce the Mona Lisa, that's fine, but it's a copy. And it's not worth as much as the original, right? We know that today. If someone were to auction off the Mona Lisa and a copy, even if the copy was perfect, it wouldn't be worth as much as the original. And that has to do with its authority. Now he says this isn't the case with technical or mechanical reproduction, right? With movies, for example, no one is really interested in the original copy of Barbie, right? When Greta Gerwig made Barbie, it was made with the idea of reproduction in mind, with the idea that there would be thousands of copies of the film that would go out to theaters all across the country to all show this reproduction of the original. It's the same with photographs. Photographs are by their nature made to be reproduced, to make multiple copies. One for you, one for your friends. This situation has only been aggravated by things like Instagram, right? So you take a picture and you copy it, and one copy goes on your Instagram, and then your friends see copies of that photo, and so on. And so what Benjamin is arguing is that in some sense, when we get to modes of art that are made specifically to be reproduced, right, the original really doesn't have the same kind of authority that an original work of art used to have. And he says, there's a couple reasons for this. The first one is that mechanical reproduction, he says, is more independent of the original. And this is a little complicated, and we'll get to that in the next slide. And the second reason, he says, is because mechanical reproduction can put the copy of an original into situations which would be out of reach for the original. Indeed, he says that with mechanical reproduction, what happens is that the original artwork meets the beholder halfway. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So with the first point, he's talking about mechanical reproduction and its independence. And he says one of the ways that you can see the independence of mechanical reproduction is just in the way that mechanical reproduction and modes of mechanical reproduction, like photography, are able to capture images, for example, in ways that you could never do before these forms of mechanical reproduction. So, for example, back in the old days, if I wanted to paint a bullet being shot through an apple, right, I'd have to imagine what it looks like and then paint it. I could never really capture that thing, right, because I couldn't even see it happening. But photography, which is this weird kind of art form, and photography is weird when you think about it, right? Photography is very strange because it captures a moment of time and keeps it still for as long as that photograph exists. It's really kind of strange. But regardless, right? I mean, if I was painting an apple, I'd sit down and I'd paint it, and I really wouldn't capture the apple. But with photography, this special form of mechanical reproduction, I can snap a picture, right? Capture an image, and capture the image in a level of detail that I could never really capture as a person, as an artist, painting it, for example, right? Because I'm able to capture a specific moment in time that happens so fast that it can't even be seen by the human eye. It's independent of the creator to an extent. Right? I mean, sure, you're the one who presses the button to take the picture, but the picture that you get, it's independent from you in a way, because it can only be accomplished with this contraption that's a camera, right? And so what happens is, it's in a way, it's independent from the artist. It stands on its own. But each successive reproduction is independent from the original as well, right? A reproduction of a picture is just as good as the original picture, right? The original photograph. And so it's independent. It's got its own life. Every copy has got its own life in a way that we don't have with things like paintings or sculptures and so on. And the second aspect of this is this idea that once we can mechanically reproduce art, it has a tendency to meet the viewer or the listener or whoever halfway. So that you can imagine, for example, back in the day, if you wanted to hear a piece of music, you had to go to a concert, right? So you'd go in and sit down, get dressed up, and sit down at a very specific time in a very specific place, and all these specific people would play their instruments for you, and you would hear it. But what happens with mechanical reproduction is that the artwork, the music in this instance, comes to you. You could sit in your chair at home and turn on your speakers and listen to Spotify as loud as you want, and in some sense you get the same kind of experience that you only used to be able to get when you went to a place and engaged in what was really kind of a ritual, right? And so what he's getting at here is that there's a certain kind of authority or authenticity to this experience. And that's tied up in part in its location, again, in time and space. It's a very specific kind of event. And it's also tied up to some degree in its ritual value. In this idea that, again, you get dressed up, you go to this specific building at this specific point in time, and all these different people have their specific roles and so on, and there's this whole kind of routine or ritual involved in going and experiencing this art that we don't find over here. When art comes to you and meets you halfway. So he says that combined, when we combine these different things, what happens is that the artwork itself becomes detached from the realm of tradition in which works of art used to be embedded. At the same time, what happens is that art substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique original, and that together these things destroy what he calls the aura of the artwork. And the aura is a really complicated idea. You could probably write a whole book trying to figure out exactly what Benjamin meant when he was talking about aura. But at its base, near as we've been able to figure out, what he's getting at is that the aura is tied up with this idea of authenticity, of originality, and of tradition, and of ritual, right? And so to give you an idea, or perhaps a better frame about how you should think about these things, for at least 1,000 years, the history of art was tied up with religion. The vast majority of artworks made over the past millennia, perhaps even two, were tied directly to religious experience. So, for example, in the last millennia, what we saw was that the Catholic Church, for example, with the Council of Trent, when the Catholic Church, which was the most powerful organization in the world, more powerful than any country or nation state, when the Catholic Church was being challenged by Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, they had a meeting. It was called the Council of Trent, and all these religious figures got together, all these Catholic religious figures, they got together and they talked about, like, how can we get people to stay with us now that we're being challenged by Protestantism? How can we get them to stay on board with Catholicism? And their answer was, well, we can propagate awe, which is a great term, right? They talked about the propagation of awe. And so they set about thinking, like, how can we awe our parishioners? And the answer was through artworks. And so as a result, what they did was they commissioned hundreds, if not thousands, of great works of art, and this went on for centuries. And so they commissioned all these great works of art that you found in these beautiful cathedrals and so on. And the only place that you could go to see these things was in the church. You'd only see them during Mass or during some sort of religious ritual. And you'd see these beautiful sculptures by people like Bernini, and these beautiful paintings, things like the Sistine Chapel, for example, and you'd be awed by it. And it gave you a sense of spirituality and of greatness, right, that people associate with God. And so this is the way art was created for 1,000 years at least. And so when people used to think of artworks, they thought of religion, and they thought of institutions and tradition and rituals. But you see, what Benjamin is saying here is that once we can reproduce art, and once art comes to meet you instead of you going to the church, for example, to see it, or the concert hall to listen to it, what happens is that this changes the artwork because it becomes detached from the realm of tradition. Right? And once you take the artwork out of the realm of tradition and out of its traditional spaces, it loses something. And Benjamin decided to describe this as aura. And I'll tell you a story. So what happened to me as a young child, I grew up in Philadelphia, and my father used to take me to the Philadelphia Museum of Art when I was a little boy. And this painting is called Prometheus Bound, and it hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I can remember as a little boy running through the museum and turning a corner and being confronted with this painting. And it is enormous. This slide can't possibly do it justice. It's enormous. And of course, when you're little, things seem bigger. And so it seemed just giant. And it was this huge painting of this bird, eating this guy's liver out. And I remember being awed by it. Just being, standing there as a little boy. I don't know how old I was, maybe 5 or 6. And just being like, holy shit, It really blew my mind. And in that context, in that place, in its original form, right, hanging in a museum, it was enormously powerful. right? So what happens then when we reproduce this thing? Well, I could go and I could buy one on Amazon right now. But I think we can all agree, besides the colors being really screwed up, it loses something, right? And part of what it loses is its aura, according to Benjamin. It loses its aura, its authority, its originality, its role in tradition, and so on, right? So when we take it out of its location, it detaches from the realm of tradition. And then the second thing he says, of course, is that it substitutes plurality for its original unique existence. And this, of course, is what an artist like Warhol was playing with his pop art back in the 1950s and 1960s. This is why we have, Marilyn Monroe reproduced 9 times on this canvas. This is why we have Elvis reproduced 3 times on this canvas, right? He's playing with the very ideas that Benjamin is discussing. What Warhol is doing is he's playing with this idea of substituting plurality, or multiple copies, for originality. And of course, these figures, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, their entire careers were made out of technical reproduction to the extent that they were movie stars and music stars. And their entire star persona, this idea of them as stars, was constructed entirely out of the reproduction of their image again and again throughout popular culture. I mean, it's really this reproduction of their image that we fell in love with rather than the people themselves. I mean, who really knew Elvis? I mean, maybe Priscilla and the Colonel and a couple other people, but all the Americans who loved Elvis, who made him, for quite a period of time, the greatest, rock and roll musician ever, was kind of an understanding not of Elvis the person, but of Elvis the reproduction, right? And the same goes for Marilyn Monroe, who really exists as kind of an empty vessel, right? Who only exists to some extent as a reproduction. And so, what he's doing here is he's playing a philosophical game. He's asking philosophical questions, and he's playing a philosophical game talking about reproduction. And so he goes on, and he talks about how mechanical reproduction just doesn't change the artwork. It changes how we look at the artwork. It changes our sense perception. And one of these changes is this desire that we have post-mechanical reproduction to bring things closer, right? We're always trying to bring things closer to us, both spatially and humanly. At the same time, Benjamin says we're overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. So what happens then? These are all examples of this, right? I mean, we can't be outside. Maybe we live in a dorm room, but we like nature and we like the idea of nature. So what do? Well, I can go to Wayfair and I can buy this wallpaper-looking thing and stick up this giant, what is essentially a giant poster or photograph of nature and put it on my wall. And I accept this reproduction instead of the real thing, right? Moreover, I'm bringing nature to me instead of me going to it, right? And this is, according to Benjamin, one of the changes that we have in the way that we see the world as we enter this phase of being able to reproduce artworks, reproduce text, reproduce media artifacts, in the world of the movie and the video and the printing press, all these things where we just constantly crank out images and works of art, right, it changes the way that we regard things, right? Here again, same kind of example, right, with Justin Bieber. I mean, what is this about? What's it like? Why the fuck, excuse my French, but why the fuck would anyone have a Justin Bieber, bedspread? Well, the answer is what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring Justin Bieber closer to you, right, both spatially and humanly. And you can't really kidnap Justin Bieber and bring him home, so instead you're going to accept this reproduction, right? And we're always trying to do it. One of the best examples of us trying to do it is Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie that famously depicts outer space and the Earth from outer space during a period of time. The movie was made during a period of time where we had never actually seen the Earth from outer space. Right? This is pre-space travel. But we're trying to bring it closer to us, right? We're trying to bring these images. This is what Stanley Kubrick is doing. He's trying to bring us this image closer to us. Right? Trying to eliminate spaces. Trying to transcend spaces. And this is, in some sense, the project of the modern era, of modernity. You don't think about it, and when I say modernity, I'm talking about the period of time from the Industrial Revolution forward. And a lot of us don't think about it, but the truth is that this, we've only been in the modern era for a couple of hundred years at most. I mean, arguably we're in the postmodern era now, but that's, we'll get to that later. But, modernity hasn't been around that long. And when we came up with steam power and the ability to move ourselves, particularly on railroads, which was the way, the first mass transit system, when we came up with this ability, it radically changed the way people thought about time and space. If you grew up in some town like Griffin, Georgia, 40 miles outside of Atlanta, you probably never made it more than 3 or 4 miles away from your house. At most, you might go 10 miles away from your house. You never would have made it to Atlanta. But then suddenly, the railroad comes along, you can hop on this train and be in Atlanta in 30 minutes. That changed the world. That blew people's minds. Right? And this is what modernity is about in some sense. Is this ability to using the fancy philosophical terms, to obliterate space and time. Trips that used to take a month now take a day. Other examples, the telephone, right? I mean, you could be hundreds of miles away and call somebody, and there you are talking to them. And in some sense, it destroys that space in between you. It also brings that person closer to you, right? And so this is, in some sense, the project of modernity. So he goes on, he says, mechanical reproduction replaces uniqueness and permanence with transitoriness and reproducibility. What he's talking about here, and this is a good example, right, is that prior to mechanical reproduction, the way that we made works of art speaks to a kind of uniqueness and a kind of permanence. So here, with this bust of Jesus, right? It's carved out of solid marble. It's unique. There's no other piece of art like it in the world. It's quite permanent to the extent that it's made out of stone. Literally, it's made out of marble. But what happens when we're able to reproduce images and artworks? Well, we get this, right? The Elvis on Black Velvet. It's not nearly as unique. There's thousands of them. It's not nearly as permanent, right? This is another symptom of modernity that extends even beyond art, is that we don't buy things to last anymore. Instead, we go to Walmart, we buy the plastic version. When it breaks, we replace it. Right? I mean, even with the expensive things we buy, right? You buy an iPhone, you pay, $1,000 for it, and a year later, you're in line for the next one. 2 years at most. Right? So this is another one of the symptoms, he says. So what does all this mean? What does he, when he's talking about the destruction of the aura? I mean, you have to admit, when he talks about the destruction of the aura, it sounds like he's bemoaning it, like it's a bad thing. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case. And so he makes this weird kind of argument later on in the reading, and he says, the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to the artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based in ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, which is politics. So what he's saying is that art for 1,000 years was about ritual, it was about tradition, right? And this was all bound up in authenticity and originality. But as soon as we can reproduce it, as soon as art can come to you, as soon as there are multiple copies, as soon as originality and authenticity don't matter anymore, as soon as you don't have to go to the cathedral to see the artwork, what happens is it loses that ritual, traditional kind of value, and instead it becomes a place of political value. Right? And in some sense, this is the promise that Benjamin sees in art, is that it can have a kind of political value. And so even if we go back to the earliest days of art, these are the cave paintings, I believe, at Lascaux in France. These are some of the oldest paintings ever. I mean, this is some of the oldest artwork that we know. And we know from the art historians who study this stuff that it was all about ritual, that you'd sit in this cave as a caveman and you'd have your fire going. And what would happen would be that these animals that you see up here on the walls would appear to move. And it was all part of a ritual related to hunting and so on. And so art always had this kind of ritual value, this kind of traditional value. But as soon as you make it so that art goes to meet the people instead of the people going to meet the art, its valence, its value turns political, right? It's propaganda, it's ideological instead of theological in value, right? And so the value of art changes. All right, so I think I'll probably quit this video here. I'll do a second part on Duguay and Fisk to follow up. So that's Benjamin. Thanks for checking this out. Let's see.